sort of make it alive. And this leads us to our first presenter today. She's visiting us from Boston, USA. Her name is Nancy Baym, and when she's not here, she studies how people, audiences, and workers understand and use communication technologies in their everyday relationships. She's the author, among other books and articles, Playing to the Crowd. It could be found outside here. Recommend to flip it through and buy it if you want, in like an online store, wherever you want. She used to be a professor of communication studies, and she now works as a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. Please give a warm welcome to Nancy Baym.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on a rainy day like this. Hi. So I'd like to tell a story about musicians and audiences and technology and connection in 3 parts. The first part being connection, second being disconnection, and the third reconnection, and then I'll finish up thinking a little bit about exploitation. So if we go back millennia, tens and tens of millennia. One of the oldest forms of technology that has been located is a bone flute, which was found in Germany, and it's estimated to be 40,000 years before Christ that this flute was made. And it was one of many flutes. It was carved out of the rib bones of birds and hollowed out. It had beautifully beveled finger holes so that people could play it very comfortably. It had a mouthpiece that was affixed with adhesive. It had a fixed scale, which is still in use in many parts of the world. I like to note that this 40,000 plus year old flute existed 30,000 years before money. And so when people talk about the value of music and how, for example, Spotify has taken all the value out of music, I say, how is that even possible when we had music for tens of thousands of years before we had money? Clearly, music's value is not in money. The only reason music has any monetary value is because of its power to connect, right? And if we look at how was that bone flute used, how was music used throughout history, until just a few hundred years ago, which to us seems like a long time, but in the big picture is hardly anything, it was used to connect, right? Music was the soundtrack for ritual. It brought people together for birth. It brought people together for mourning. It brought people together for worship. It was used to connect people to one another and to their deities. So this went on for tens of thousands of years. And if you think about what must music have been like during that time, it would have been very strange to think about it in terms of fans, musicians and their fans, right? It's hard for me to imagine. I have this image of these cave people running around going, hey, you gotta see Erg, he's awesome on the bone flute. You'll love him. I just don't think it worked that way. I think that what we know is that music and its performance was part of participatory community, right? And one person might be the person who happened to be playing that bone flute, but it wasn't that they were a genius. It was that they happened to be the one who had the bone flute at that moment. And perhaps they were a little better at it than others or liked it a little more, but it didn't give them special status as some kind of genius who stood apart from others. It just helped to bring the community together. There's a magnificent book by a historian and musicologist named Gary Tomlinson. The book is called A Million Years of Music, and it ends with the invention of the bone flute. And he actually argues that prior to humans coming into existence, our predecessors, these 8 human thingies that were evolving, they existed together in these common taskscapes, he calls them. And of course, one of the things you had to do a lot back then was hammer things with rocks, right? If you were gonna make pokey things so that you could eat those bison or whatnot. And his argument is that, so these creatures are all standing around, you know, and the other one's going like this. And they notice that, if we do it together, this is more fun. It passes more quickly. This is kind of good. And his argument is that it's actually that connection, that ability to recognize rhythm that you were making together that allowed us to evolve into social beings who are capable of connection. So rather than we became human and then we invented music, we invented rhythm and entrainment, and then we became human. So technology and sociality are connected from their earliest moments, and connected in large part through music and through rhythm. So that's 40,000 years ago. And then for the next tens of thousands of years, up until about 800 years ago, music stayed pretty much in that province of participatory connection. And the concept of audience didn't make a lot of sense, right? You didn't go to church to hear the choir. The choir happened to be there, and anybody could be participating in that choir. But then along comes mass media and recording technology. And recording technology, in many ways, was fantastic for music. It was really great for music listeners, right? We could suddenly listen to the most magnificent music in our own home. If you lived in a small town, you might never get to hear brilliant music, but you could buy a record now and you could listen to beautiful music in your own home. But it had the consequence, mass media, of disconnecting audiences from the people who made the music. So that whereas before a musician was very much part of the community, after this the musician is taken out of the community and put on a pedestal, right? There's a wonderful quote from Keith Richards where he talks about fans up front at Rolling Stones concerts worshiping him, and he says, "I'm just an old junkie with a guitar. People really need deities if they're worshiping me." So we sort of turn to these people who used to be members of our community and started thinking of them as something better than us, something more special than us, and audiences came to be. However, in that story of disconnection, where the people who make the music and the people who listen to the music are so far apart, the people who listen to the music responded to this by forming tighter connections with one another. So out of this came fan community and audiences with really strong commitments to one another around that artist. So people may love the Rolling Stones, but they may love the Rolling Stones fans even more because that's their people, right? And so over the course of the 20th century, audiences and fans in particular developed really strong communities and really strong senses of what they value as a community. They value identity. They say, I am a such and such fan. That's who I am, right? And if you think about people who are, say, fans of The Cure, you might recognize them walking down the street because they look like Cure fans, right? And they see one another and they say, ah, yes, you're my people. A strong sense of community that goes with that, of course. We are this fan group. You get clubs, things like that. The musician Billy Bragg told me about a fan who comes to his shows all the time and says to him, I don't actually like your music anymore. I haven't bought anything you've made in 10 years, but I would never miss a show because this is what my friends do. We go to your shows together. So even when you don't care about the music, it still provides the excuse for the connection. Identity, community, also creativity. Fans started making things for one another, often using technology, fan videos, fanzines, all sorts of things. They value information, who's got information about the acts, who's got insight. And then when the internet came along, there were a lot of music fans involved in building the internet. It's not a story often told, but the internet developed in part in California. Often the story of its first connections is connecting San Francisco to LA. And of course, if you think about San Francisco at the time this happened, 1969, you are in the center of Grateful Dead fandom. And there were a lot of Grateful Dead fans involved in the development of the internet. And from its earliest days, literally as soon as they invented the concept of the mailing list, they said, ooh, we can use this to exchange Dead tickets. Awesome, right? As soon as they figured out how to digitize text, they digitized Grateful Dead lyrics and gave them to John Perry Barlow, who then went on and decided the internet was maybe an interesting thing. We're now in a time of reconnection where we have social media and artists say, oh great, I can get online and I can connect with my fans and then I can engage them and then I can monetize them and I can have a career, right? And they're often told this, you know, if you want to have a career, you got to connect. It's really important to connect, to foster that connection. I was just last week speaking at Universal Music Group in London, and I had a crowd about this size, and I said, how many of you think that it's important for artists to connect with their audiences using social media? How many of you think it doesn't matter? Everybody agrees that you're supposed to connect somehow, that this is essential to your career, to your work. Now, when musicians go online to connect, they meet audiences who have been connected for tens of years, right? And who have already set the terms for what should that kind of participation in those communities look like. So when they show up and they say, hey, I dropped a new album, come buy it, the audience says, that's not how we connect. We talk to each other. We share what's going on in our lives. And indeed, there is an increased expectation that artists are in almost daily connection. And they're not just broadcasting information like they did in mass media, but they're participating in the communities and they're participating by sharing. MTV did a study where they talked about an expectation that artists should share intimate glimpses into their mundane daily activities. Or as one of the artists I spoke with, Mark Kelly, talked about, it used to be that rock stars, pop stars just dropped out of the sky and now they're tweeting about what they had for breakfast. Interesting times though, nobody knows where to draw the boundaries and what works and what doesn't. So we have this fantastic potential for reconnection now, and when I talk to musicians, they often talk about really profoundly moving experiences that they have because of this reconnection. Some of the things Martin was just talking about. They talk about learning what their music meant to people, hearing stories. A really common story I heard often was learning that their music had helped somebody deal with somebody's death. So I got a letter from a fan. He said, my father just died, all I can do is listen to your music. Or, I always fight with this guy about politics on my Facebook page, but then he sent me a message and said, my mother is dying and her death wish is to hear this particular song of yours. And it might be more mundane things. It might be, this is the song we played at our wedding. Or, this is the first song I played for my child when he was born. It might be something like Zoe Keating told me a wonderful story of getting an email from a fan in Iraq serving in the military, and she said, I like to think of my music as being made for wide open spaces, and I thought, maybe when they're driving the tank across the desert listening to my songs, my music will make it so they don't shoot, right? So they have these really wonderful moments where they learn that their music matters so much more than they thought it did, and it could have impact so much greater than they believed it could, and they find that validation and that sense of this is who I am and this is why I matter. For fans, of course, it's awesome when these people are online. You can tweet at them and they tweet back, and it's an incredible moment of connection. I've had moments where I got a direct message from a celebrity I particularly admire, and I don't think I touched the ground for about a week afterwards. I was just the happiest girl in the world. So it can be wonderful, it can be fantastic. It can also be sort of dangerous, right? Because you can find out that this person is not the person you wanted them to be. They're actually the real person, and what a disappointment. They're not God after all, they're human. For the artists, there's this pressure to be doing this. And the pressure, like I said, is not just to be in contact, but it's to be in this sort of intimate contact, this kind of quasi-interpersonal contact, where you're perhaps acting more like friends than like an artist to be admired. For some of them, that feels great. For others, it's a struggle. But for all of them, it's work. It's labor. And I write about this in the book as relational labor, the work of maintaining these relationships, of building them and keeping them going. And they do offer these fantastic moments, but they also come at a price. Every moment is a moment where you could be working. You're sitting at home on Sunday morning having your coffee. Oh, should I be on Twitter talking to my fans? Should I take a picture of this cup of coffee and make an Instagram story out of it, right? Every moment of your life becomes potential fodder for selling your work, right? And this also comes with abuse, right? Especially if you're a woman or a person of color or a woman of color on the internet, you're bound to receive a lot of hostility. People I talk to get death threats, they get rape threats, they get people who just really enjoy telling them what a jerk they are. And then sometimes they reply, and the response, if they get one, is usually, oh, I forgot you're a real person, sorry. Right? So we can question whether it's fair that people feel like they have to maintain these personal relationships with everybody. Which brings me to the final point I want to make, which is about exploitation. And the reason I talk about this as relational labor is that there is an element in which this work, pleasurable and challenging as it may, makes money for people who are not those people, right? And we live in a time of rising economic inequality and a time where tech leaders are rising to the top there. So when everybody feels, and it's not just musicians, it's people in a wide variety of fields, feel like I have to be on the internet and I have to be using these social network platforms in order to connect so I can engage and monetize, there are people monetizing that interaction, right? But whether it's the artist and the audience remains to be seen, right? We can point to some artists and we can say, well, yes, they did a great job of connecting through social media, they built an audience, they have a successful career. But we can point to other artists and say, they did a great job connecting with audiences, nobody listens to them, right? They follow them on Twitter, they follow them on Instagram, they don't go to their concerts, they don't buy their records. And we can point to other people and say, they don't use social media and they're superstars. So the connection is very unclear whether these things really work. But what is extremely clear is that the people who own these platforms are making a tremendous amount of money based on the assumption that we need to use these things. And so I think about this in the context of artists and audiences, but I think it filters down to all of us that we all experience moments of joy and connection and powerful relationships through online media, but I would like us to question whether the economic benefits of those connections are distributed fairly, or whether what we're doing is seeing an ever-increasing exploitation of these valuable connections between humans for other people's economic profit. So I will leave you on that very cynical note. Thank you.